My goal was to visit the Met for the first time. I got off the subway stop on the other side of Central Park, and as I strolled across it, I stumbled upon a secret cottage garden nestled in the core of New York.
I'm here in Central Park in the English Cottage Garden.
Alright, let's stop here. This is not going to be the typical tour video. Instead, I want to invite you to take a deeper look at the way this garden is designed.
As an avid home gardener myself, I wanted to take you on this stroll as we analyze exactly what makes that garden work.
We will brush upon the controversial history of the park and question why do we even attempt to create quaint gardens today.
But mainly I want to break down the design tips and tricks that make that hidden gem into a memorable space.
To help you do the same in your own home. Since if it is possible to replicate pastoral England in the middle of the iconic city, then it should be possible to do so anywhere, including our most suburban of homes. Let's see what design lessons we can glean from walking through Central Park's Cottage Garden. While Central Park dates back to the mid-1800s, the Shakespeare Garden, as this area is called, was a later addition celebrating the plant diversity in the bard's writing during the 1916 tricentennial commemoration of the writer's death. The spot has gone through phases of care and neglect, including a rough time during the 70s. But I've got to say that today it flourishes as a well-maintained but carefree cottage garden. We start our tour going down the main road of access into the garden. Upon first glance, I could see that this was a special place, flanked by a rock outcropping on the left and a meadowy forest to the right. The main approach to the garden takes us down a sort of valley. It's quite the bucolic scene, exuding a sense of place different from all other areas of the park. This is achieved by a tapestry of elements working in harmony. It immediately feels like you're entering into a different world. To create a cottage garden ourselves, we must understand the basic building blocks to sculpt the space. Mixing fruit trees into the landscape is just a hallmark of cottage gardening. Double-duty edible structural plants offer us a few forms to work with. The spherical natural form of most fruit and nut trees gives us the opportunity to create low-maintenance walls to envelop our space. Shrubby plants like blueberry bushes can be pruned to provide further formality to the garden, helping organize the space. Vining forms like grape and kiwi allow for more inventive structures like pergolas and fences, even if more maintenance is required. The high-maintenance espalier pruning of fruit trees allows for even more formal shapes. They give old-world charm and help establish defined wall-like structures in the garden. We can see this implemented through our right as we go down the main approach.
We see here espalier pear trees. They give structure, and you know what? I'm absolutely sure that seeing this in early spring and midsummer must be glorious.
Training them as flat espaliers that function as wall-like partitions helps the space feel more enclosed and human-scaled. By planting them along the path, they create a corridor effect that makes for a perfect blend of human intervention onto a natural landscape. Whereas clipped hedges may be at times too formal for cottage gardens, their shaggy look is perfect, especially as they flower in fruit.
I see a lot of rose bushes here that probably create cascading elements throughout the garden. But even at this late stage, it's still quite wonderful.
While plants did call my attention first, the shape of the land is the most fundamental element in this garden. The main roads of access and topography of this spot have remained the same as envisioned by its famed landscape architect, Frederick Law Olmsted, even though this garden didn't exist at the time. Part of the genius of the park is precisely how the flat and swampy terrain was transformed artificially into a hilly countryside. You would never know. Well, except the terrain was anything but flat. I knew that the park had been sculpted from swampy land, but instead of starting with flat land, upon further research, I discovered that the site was swampy but hilly, with many rocky outcroppings. In other words, marginal land. It makes absolute sense why this became the chosen spot for the park. It was really an economic choice. In their 1852 report, the Special Committee on Parks argued that Central Park will include grounds almost entirely useless for building purposes, owing to the very uneven and rocky surface, and also to its lying so far below the proper grade of the streets as to render the grading very costly. Nonetheless, sculpting the land was a huge undertaking. Swamps were dug up to create lakes, boggy land was drained, ravines were modified to form gentle and picturesque hills, stone outcroppings were blasted and sometimes revealed to compose new scenes, like in the area of the current cottage garden. All this was done with the brute force of horses and humans. at least 5 of whom died due to explosives, which sadly for the time was seen as a low number. Little care was given to the life of working class people. All this toil gave us a landscape carefully molded to heighten its picturesque appeal. One ingenious feature of the Olmsted plan was the inclusion of 4 sunk roads traversing the park to allow traffic from both sides of the city to connect while hiding it from view. Even more incredible is the fact that 79th Street runs right beside this pastoral haven, sunk in a ditch hidden from view.
And then we see that the city is right around the corner.
This sculpted topography allows us to forget the city as we venture into the park. This type of space manipulation is not something feasible in most of our gardens, but we can adapt the principles in a more modest scale. Cottage gardens need to feel enclosed, so if your house sits in a desolate lawn, planting hedges or espalier fruit trees to section off the area into personal spaces can be quite effective. Large raised beds or half-sunk areas can give the privacy and homely feel to an otherwise unsheltered space. Of course, these interventions can still be costly, and I personally prefer to use low-impact solutions when customizing my space. Ultimately, shaping garden rooms only through the use of plants is the most affordable choice, but that doesn't mean we must forego other lighter hardscape elements that don't involve excavating your front garden to texture your scene. Hardscape elements like rustic fences and benches can further cement the informal aspect of a cottage garden. And this is something that the Shakespeare Garden does masterfully. It is also what helps give the feeling of being in a special place. As we go down the main road, we can see rustic fences on both sides.
I think the first thing that you can see is their use of rustic wood to create a more informal path, and it gives structure at the same time while keeping a natural look. It kind of goes against the more formal Olmsted style of the landscaping.
The gnarly aspect of the fences is the main repeating element that sells the space, differentiating it from the rest of the park. With that and the use of rough stones for paths, a cohesive, worn-down rhythm established throughout the space. We can easily replicate this in our own gardens. Using twigs, logs, and stone as hardscape elements is a surefire and economic way of making any landscape feel more unpretentious and homespun. I have used this in my garden time and again, making semi-permanent structures that are allowed to rot and be replaced. A simple twig tutor can instantly create a humble center point. For a more involved project, branches can be used to create a rustic bench or pergola. Simple cut logs or woven twigs can make for perfectly imperfect garden edging. Even though hardscape elements help establish the sense of place, ultimately a cottage garden is defined by the choice of plants and the way they grow together. As we go down the main road, to our right side we see a meadow-like planting. Meadow-like plantings further cement the informality of this space.
Their choice of flowers is quite on point in terms of wispy plants, and they use a lot of natives also.
As I explained in depth in my cottage garden plant selection masterclass, to create the effect of a cottage garden, you must use a combination of plant forms to weave a textured composition. I divide plants into 7 groups, including bushy, filling the space, columnar, adding height, sculptural, creating bold focal points, wispy, adding whimsy, vining, adding movement, sprawlers, filling gaps, and the weeping panicle, forming a roof, so to speak. Of all of these, wispy, sprawler, and weeping panicles are especially essential to achieve the look, and we can clearly see them in the Shakespeare Garden. Choosing small flowered plants in drifts also contributes to forming the ethereal, diaphanous arrangements. But one other element is the stitching thread that holds the cottage garden quilt together. The use of color is the other big aspect that signals a cottage mood, and it has a lot to do with plant choice. Next, we go to the other side of the road where there's more plantings amongst rock outcroppings.
Their color scheme is also on point. You see a lot of the pinkish and bluish lavenders, some deeper purples and whites.
Having a dominant color ties the landscape together. Additionally, choosing small flowered, small leafed, airy plants creates drifts of color dots that make it read as an ethereal meadow. Even certain varieties of common garden plants may be better suited than others.
And you know what? This hosta, I had never seen it before. Probably is a common variety. for landscapers. I never liked hosta that much. The inflorescence is quite amazing, and even the foliage, it's a little bit more lanceolate. That makes for a much more interesting hosta than the typical suburban roundish deer food.
Beside the shadier main approach going downhill, the Shakespeare Garden's main core is situated over a sunny hill. This hilly topography is original to the Olmsted plan. However, a new winding path with stone steps invites the visitor to explore further. We'll veer off from the main road and go up the steps into the sunny part of the garden.
Let's go up these stairs. You see symmetrical hedges, kind of formal but not quite. The stone is the right material for the steps.
This entrance reveals a rare use of symmetry and formality in the space. While asymmetrical and free-form compositions are preferred for cottage gardens, providing a geometric skeleton to the space, or at least to the entryways, can help arrange the plantings into a more pleasing and balanced composition. For instance, a straight path with a pair of elements flanking an entrance will provide enough order to an otherwise wild garden, thus creating a natural focal point. Likewise, repeated elements that form a rhythm can glue together an otherwise chaotic scene. Having only solid geometric hedges around straight paths also propels the visitor forward, offering something more colorful and complex in the distance.
As I'm discovering, this is the first time I'm seeing it with you guys, and I see a bunch of color over in the distance. This is how you design a cottage garden.
As we go up the steps, we reach the heart of the cottage garden. Unlike in the straight-to-the-point staircase, this destination invites the visitor to stop and linger because of all the complex colors and shapes. However, the presence and continuation of a few broken up asymmetrical hedges help to bridge one part to the other with a smooth transition of forms. And that's a masterful design technique, because if done right, you don't even notice it.
Look at this. This is what we're talking about when we talk about color. We have a predominance of the pinks and yellows, but then you also have some reds, which should be a clashing color overall, but they're kind of hidden, and you get this cloud-like formation of color.
As I explained in the color masterclass, the punchier broken up red color in this bed is serving like an underpainting tone that peeks through the foreground to give an electric effect to the composition. Pinks and purples are the main colors in this garden. Yellow is a pleasing complement. The red, however, if brought to the foreground, it could completely change the overall effect, overpowering everything. In this way, however, it is kept in check, energizing the shadows.
And over here we have another hot spot with some structural plants. It's probably canna and some zinnias, and of course the pollinators are having a blast.
We continue on and turn a corner, and we can see the varied plantings of this area. Filling up every square inch of soil with plants is truly the one rule of cottage gardening.
Wow, there's some autumn crocuses over here in the spot. And creating these nooks and crannies that you discover is what a cottage garden is all about.
Okay, let me pause here. Once again, we see the optical color blending that I talked about being practiced. The punchier pink coleus is being partially obstructed by this wiry and lacy green plant, subduing the intensity of the stronger color. If those green leaves are not scaffolding over the brighter pink ones, that patch would be just a bit too bright for a subtle cottage effect. From this spot, we can continue on going up the hill to find more of the colorful plantings.
These are beautiful flowers. And I have a suspicion, I have a sneaking suspicion, even though late summer is still quite a glorious time, I have a sneaky suspicion that mid-May to June is when this place shines. I need to do a better job in my own garden around this time of the year, so I'm getting a lot of inspiration from the plant selection, and considering that many are very well adapted to the area.
My garden is abundant in colorful blooms from April pushing into August in a good year, but I need to plan better for late summer and fall to extend the display. Finding the right plants will be essential.
I need to know what aster this is, because this would make a lot of sense in my house, even though it's kind of a bluish, oh, it's not really a bluish pink, it's sort of in the middle, so it's a nice color that could go either warm tone or cool tone.
With all these elements in mind, we must think of the overall organization of the space. The sunnier clearing serves as the hub for the Shakespeare Garden since it provides enough light for the colorful and flowering plants to thrive. Central Park today is quite a shady park, especially since the tree cover has increased through the years. That's not quite how Olmsted had envisioned the space, but I gotta say, I rather like how things turned out. In any case, the opening of the canopy on this hill gives the garden the golden bowl effect. It's a term I once read in a gardening book. It describes the structure of an idealized garden that is surrounded by tall trees on the borders, shorter shrubs on the edge, and a center sunny position with flowering plants decreasing in height towards a center path or a lawn area. This is the overall rule, but it should be broken to an extent, as in the case of the large bed spaces between the paths. Higher plants should generally go in the middle of those. This helps obscure parts of the garden to create mystery. We can still keep ground-hugging sprawlers towards the edge of the path.
I like that they use the height in the center of the bed and then they progressively stratify the shorter plants.
Keeping the paths edged with short plants like this sweet potato vine gives the cottage garden a finished look. Using the idealized golden bowl plan allows sunlight to reach plants and still create a secluded garden room effect. That's exactly how this garden makes us feel. The surrounding trees, they form walls that allow the center portion to feel like an enchanted forest glade. This is a concept we can apply to our home gardens at any scale as long as we are mindful of solar exposure. In a tiny lot, it is the only way that we can cram in a variety of plants and still make the space organized. In a larger property, breaking the space into separate garden rooms, each obeying the golden bowl plan within their shorter plantings, while having taller trees in the overall perimeter, also obeying the golden bowl concept at a higher level, will make each space feel like a self-contained little world. Ultimately, the experience of walking through and using a garden should inform how it's planned. The other way this garden manipulates the spatial experience is through winding, curving paths that go up the center knoll.
Part of the experience of a cottage garden is to make you wander, both wander and wonder, and you go through these paths. If they narrow as you progress, the sense of discovery, a secret garden up ahead increases, and you really want to know what's right there as you turn the corner, and you find little spots with interesting flowers in the middle, and you go back to main paths.
Now, whether your garden is big or small, it's essential to create a destination worth traveling to. This can be a vista, a hideaway, or another garden room. Just having winding paths without a sense of reward will most likely mean the garden never gets used. Yeah, but this is harder to execute in a tiny garden where creating a journey of a mystery towards a destination is literally impossible. But integrating a bench or a small eating area framed by colorful plantings can create enough of an inviting focal point to make the space work. In the Shakespeare Garden, they use the top of the knoll as the perfect destination with a view. Whether we arrive to this location from the bottom, as we did, or from the other side, this happens to be the center of the garden.
And amongst the most important parts of a cottage garden is having a place to sit and admire, and they were good at choosing this spot here for the seating with the same kind of material as the fencing. They built these benches here, and the benches are overlooking this view, this higher hill-like formation. And you have a wall of honeysuckle. So they're doing several things at the same time. They appeal to this sense of smell at this time of the year with the smell of the honeysuckle.
To punctuate the journey, a sundial is found right next to the benches at the highest point. This location is right beside the overlook.
I think they could have a little bit better focal point here. They have the sundial, but maybe it's a little bit too small for this type of a garden, and needed something a little bit more substantial, especially considering this is a public garden in a public city. But can't really complain because they've gotten everything else pretty solid.
Perhaps a medieval fountain or gazebo would have created the perfect ending focal point to this garden. Nonetheless, the effect of the garden as a space is remembered, even as we exit back into the rest of the park. After going through the curved path, we arrive at the end of the garden. This is where the garden transitions back into the rest of the park.
And then you happen into more formal steps and wider avenues. Still the same plants repeated, the white daisies, the crocuses there, creating this vignette.
Spotting the Belvedere Castle as we exit the Shakespeare Garden is quite the effective way of ending this journey. These fake structures called garden follies were often employed in landscaping to create landmarks within a garden. We humans do have a preference for spaces with a sense of place, and Olmsted was just a master of shaping land to do just that. These spots generally feel complete and unique. They often stimulate imagination. And that leads us to the question. So why do we even make quaint cottages? Is it not an attempt at recreating an imagined escapist pastiche of a glorified past? Ultimately, yeah. Yeah, and about that, as I was researching more information of how Central Park came to be, I went over to research antique maps of New York housed in the Library of Congress, and a hidden history became apparent. The area that is now Central Park had already been subdivided as streets and avenues. At least that was the ideal vision for the planners of the time. But because the terrain was not ideal to build on, this area had been home to marginalized groups who built cottages with gardens and livestock for their own subsistence. Even though planners had originally subdivided the area into lots, as indicated in the map, settlement of the land was sparse. Most people lived downtown. As the city grew, uptown landowners lobbied for the creation of the park as a way of screening out the new poor residents and their associated trades, an early form of zoning, and as a means of removing the existing poor population, an early form of urban renewal, what we call today gentrification. And it's not surprising that 90% of the population settled in the area were Irish and German immigrants and African Americans. While polite society often labeled them as squatters, records often contradict that. Of note was Seneca Village, a community of mainly African Americans and some Irish immigrants known for its stability and relative prosperity. And Seneca Village was not too far from the location of the cottage garden today. And honestly, the people there had true working cottage gardens and were displaced from that land to make way for the park, which included a pastoral recreation of a cottage garden, even if it happened later in the future. Now, isn't that ironic, don't you think? So why do we even make cottage gardens? Well, as a gardener, I don't think there's such a thing as a pastiche garden, especially one that you grew from seed and toiled with your sweat, blood, and tears, because ultimately gardening is the one activity that unites humans throughout the ages. We may not depend on our gardens to survive as the cottagers of yesteryear did. Still, gardening is when we are the most connected with everything that's around us, and even though it's not a full-on return to nature, it's like preparing a parlor for nature to visit. And sometimes we just want that parlor to be pleasant and comfortable so that we can sit a spell and visit with that long-lost friend. Please let me know in the comments if you enjoy this format and would like to see me visit and analyze other public gardens. The inkwash paintings of Central Park featured in the transitions of the video and other artwork are available for purchase in my Etsy shop if you would like to support the channel and ensure more videos are made. I've only been able to make these more involved, edited, and illustrated videos because of my patrons and supporters like you. Thank you so much for watching and see you next time.